So, as I was preparing for this talk, I was super curious about who you guys are, who would kind of be coming to this and take 40 minutes to listen to whatever I came up with. And you know, I went on the meetup and was kind of trying to like sleuth you out a bit, and there wasn't that much information. So I thought that I would start today by just kind of asking you a couple questions, as maybe any researcher would. So how many of you are actually full-time researchers? Oh, cool, there's one. I'm like, now I know 4 other UX researchers. That's awesome. How many of you are designers? Okay, wow, that's like everyone. How many of you are product managers? Cool, 2. Do we have any preschoolers in the audience? Awesome. Do we have any other roles represented? Yeah. What is it?
I'm an instructional designer.
Awesome. Cool. So I wanted to ask you guys, just to kind of get a sense before we get started, like, half of you are my friends and family, and probably some of you are just leftovers from the 9 o'clock talk that sounded really interesting, but I'm curious, like, why you guys showed up. Maybe just like a couple answers, if anyone's brave enough. No one is. Everyone's like, no, we're leftovers from that. Yeah, Sam. What'd you say?
I run the event.
Yeah, thanks, man. Those are the 3rd reason. What were you gonna say, Sam?
I really like the title of your piece.
Awesome.
I agree with it. Largely. I've done a lot of research myself on sort of running relation to yourself already.
Cool.
Yeah, it seems like the idea that you brought up is a problem that applies to
A lot of companies. Awesome. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I just really enjoy coming to like meetups because I feel like there's a lot of stuff that you can learn that you're not expecting to, and you can apply it in your own life.
Cool. Yeah, so just like learning new stuff, kind of coming to these meetups. Was there one more? Yeah.
Research is such a big part of what we do as designers. And when that stuff gets missed, we spin our wheels and how we do our work.
Yeah.
So it's just such a big push for data-driven design. We have to engage more with research and figure out our role.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much. So she said, basically, as designers, research is such a crucial part, and when we don't do it, we end up spinning our wheels and wasting a lot of time. I was curious to get to know you guys, and then I thought maybe you would be curious to get to know me a little bit, because every time I go and I see a speaker, I'm always obviously interested in the topic, but also just really interested in kind of like the career of that person and how they got to where they are, and maybe that's partially why I'm a researcher, because I'm really fundamentally like just very curious about people and why they do the things they do and kind of how they got to the point they did. So I thought I would just maybe introduce myself in a couple quick facts. So I grew up in Southern California. My dad is a musician, businessman, and my mom is a makeup artist. Basically, I've just been looking for opportunities to publicly show this photo of my dad to more people, because that's not a perm or a wig. This is my mom in the 80s with someone who's kind of famous. I can't even remember her name, but she sent me this photo. My first job was actually as a model, like probably not that surprising growing up in Southern California. This was definitely like the peak of my career, and I've been just trying to get back to that like level of confidence ever since. My next job was at Domo, so this was my first job out of school, and I kind of like had a product management role, but it's a startup, so like who knows what your job really is, like it's changing week to week. This was my team, we're part of it. Then I worked at Vivint Smart Home, and actually yesterday was my last day at Vivint Smart Home as a UX researcher. And so starting in a couple weeks, I'll actually be moving to San Francisco and joining the team at LinkedIn on their research team, so super exciting. And then as Ben mentioned, I started a podcast, so the first episode came out in March, and it's a podcast, but it's also a Slack group, and just kind of like been blossoming and growing into a number of different things, like a Medium publication, and as I was putting this slide together, I was thinking about it on my way in today. I thought it's kind of a misnomer to say that I started it. And I actually wanted Laura to stand up just for a second. You have to. This is Laura, and I just wanted to publicly call her out for basically being the reason that the podcast and the project has had any success at all, because she actually has done like all the creative direction, the logo, everything, and like really, really made it look so professional. So I strongly recommend coming to community things like this, but even more so I recommend making really good friends with people who will just do stuff with you, even if it's like weird and you have no business doing it. So Mixed Methods has been really, really fun and cool, right? So I'm pretty new, like to be totally honest, to the research space. As I mentioned, I kind of started in more of a product management role and then was in analytics and operations. And then I got really into UX research, which is what I'm going to talk about next. But just to give you a little bit of an idea of the project and like the scope of it, I've had a chance to just like talk to so many really cool people. You know, like a couple months ago, I had a conversation with one of the people who was on the team who first invented touchscreens, and he was telling me, he was telling me about, you know, like the time Steve Jobs came to his lab in Maryland and was like, this sucks, this is awesome, this is awesome, this sucks. And it's just been so cool, like getting to hear these stories about kind of like our origin as a community, right? Like as a tech community, as a research community. And so these are just some of the people who have been involved. I attended a conference as press, got to visit some super cool offices, and definitely got the job that I most recently will be starting at LinkedIn because of this project. Okay, so why do I care about UX research? I definitely didn't study it in school, had no idea what it was probably even 2 years ago, to be totally honest. Like had some inkling of different research methods that I was trying out in that PM role, but you know, I came fresh out of school and I was starting this job at this tech company, and what would happen is executives would come to me and they would say, hey, I have this really cool idea, right? Like we should build this app, we should do this thing, and I would be like, oh, totally. Like you've been doing this for so long, this is such a cool idea, like I'm just gonna do it, right? Like that's what I was supposed to do, that was the task I was given. And what ended up happening over and over was I would spend all this time and effort building something, and I would put my blood, sweat, and tears into it, and then it would be done, and nothing would happen, right? It was like, wait a second, who do we actually build this for? Or what problem are we solving? And these were things that we had lightly touched on, but these executives would just be so excited about this idea, right? And we just had to urgently get after it. And after 3 years or 2.5 years of doing this, I just kind of got to this point where I was like, I no longer trust people, especially people with C in their title. And I thought, what is the best way to kind of push back and be able to have a voice at this table as someone who's really junior, right? And I don't have, you know, $1 million whatever success startup story under my belt. I don't have over a decade of experience in this industry, but what I do have is a curiosity about the actual problems that people are really trying to solve. Right? And I wanted to spend my days working on problems that mattered to someone besides my boss. And so I got really interested in UX research. And I kept having these moments where you know, people would be telling me about this person's a visionary and we just have to do what they say, we have to get in line. And I just kept thinking to myself over and over, you're not a creative genius, this person is not a creative genius, they're just a human being like everyone else. And the subtitle, I think, for this talk would be, at least I hope not, right? And there's a number of reasons for that, which I want to get into. So I figured, personally, I learn the best when I just hear stories. So I thought I would tell you a few stories that are really impactful or really meaningful to me. So how many of you have heard of Better Place? Cool, that's awesome. Okay, so Better Place was this super exciting startup founded in October 2007. And everyone was so excited about them, right? They were going to revolutionize the world. It was this entrepreneur, Shai Agazi, and he was an Israeli entrepreneur, and he was like, I am gonna get rid of oil. Big oil, we're gonna take down big oil, we're gonna make these electric cars. And basically what his premise was was that the reason that like electric cars weren't really working was because of the inconvenience of charging the battery, right? So like that experience of going home and having to plug in your car, and like not everyone has a garage, and maybe you need to go on a longer trip, and kind of like the stress around that experience. So he was like, well, you know, I'm gonna make these service stations where either you can charge your battery really quickly, or you can actually just swap it out. So I'm gonna build like this robot arm, and it's gonna like take the battery out of your car, and it's gonna be so easy and great. And he just had this like huge ambition, right? And my reading of the situation, I obviously wasn't there, but his core competency was really in this salesmanship, right? Like he sold this idea to the point where his first round, a month after the company was founded, was $200 million. Okay, that's like a lot of money, at least to me. And people were just so excited about the idea, like everyone wanted in on it. So this is a quote from kind of a recap of what happened with the whole situation, but people said, Agassiz got virtually every meeting he asked for. The press anointed him the creator of the next big thing. Money from investors came fast and in big waves, roughly $900 million. And it seemed like it would never stop flowing, right? So it was like this amazing story. You know, it was this guy who was not only gonna, make $1 zillion, he was also gonna change the world for the better. He was gonna get rid of big oil, and especially as like this Israeli entrepreneur, this story was super powerful and motivating, right? Because you think of the political context of Israel in the middle of all of these, big oil countries that have a lot of animosity toward little Israel. So it was a story that really got people excited, as you can tell by the crazy amounts of money he was getting. So what happened, right? He built all of this infrastructure in Israel. He hires this amazing designer to like build him the most beautiful charging stations. They just pour millions and millions and millions of dollars into this idea that like, even now thinking about it, I'm like, that's super cool and exciting. Like, I would kind of be interested in like a car where the battery swaps out, right? So what happened? They had promised that they would basically take over the market, right? Like in the first few years, they would take over 50% of the market, even though the largest leader had 15%, Hyundai. And what happened was Better Place sold 100 cars in its first 2 months, mostly to employees. Like it was a resounding failure, just like a total disaster. And not that long after, it closed, right? So 6 years, the whole thing, beginning to end, and it was just like went up in flames, right? So these were the articles that were being written. A broken place, the spectacular failure of the startup that was going to change the world. With almost $1 billion in funding and ambitions to replace petroleum-based cars with a network of cheap electrics, Shai Agassi's Better Place was remarkable even by the standards of world-changing startups. So it was an epic failure, a 21st century cautionary tale. And to me, it's amazing that this whole room, one person heard of this company, right? Like, it's crazy. It's a huge amount of money. It's a huge idea. There was so much excitement. He was giving TED Talks. He was on late night shows. Like, everyone was so excited about this. Everyone was so bought into this idea. I just love you guys. I hope you like my transitions as much as I do. I just feel like they're really underappreciated. Anyway, so here is a picture of the charging stations, right? So like, this was not just an idea. Like, he had built the physical infrastructure in Israel. Like, it was real. Like, he had done so much of this, right? And so, why? Was it a bad idea? Like, it was just like swappable batteries, weird, like, what was the deal, right? Well, so it wasn't a bad idea. I mean, Tesla, right, like a few months before Better Place shut their doors, actually like went on stage, Elon Musk went on stage in an event, drove a Tesla on stage in a contraption below the stage, swapped the battery in 90 seconds. So like, this is still technology that's being considered and put forth, right? Like these are still ideas that are going forth. So I would say that it wasn't the idea, like it seems like a cool idea, right? Like I would love an electric car that did that. So why? And I would point to a few things. So first of all, no focus, right? Like they just had gobs and oodles of money. And so when you kind of read about like the postmortem of what happened to them, they didn't have to focus at all. They had offices everywhere before they even had sold one car. They had tons of employees. They were operating like this huge conglomeration before they had even figured out if anyone wanted one of these cars, right? Like they were doing deals with politicians and it was Poland actually, to make sure that like new legislature coming out would allow, like They just did everything, everywhere, all at once, right? There was no focus. Too certain, right? So Shai Agassiz was, basically conceiving himself to be a prophet, right? This is Think Different, Agassiz said, quoting the Apple slogan. Agassiz had long seen himself as an Apple Jobs-like figure. The failure of GM, which was something that he kind of predicted, and the public reaction to it made him think he was a prophet, right? That's crazy. But the funny thing about this story is, I don't think that this is that unique. Probably all of us can think of an instance or a person that we know who's this way, right? Who spends oodles of money, who grows and grows and grows before they even have an idea if anyone wants what they're selling, who thinks that they're right without asking anyone, without actually getting another opinion, right? I think this is something that you often run into because there's this myth of Steve Jobs, right? People are always referring to him as he's a visionary, he's a Steve Jobs-esque figure. And that always makes me laugh because it's Steve Jobs was never I'm a Thomas Edison figure. No, he was thinking differently. He wasn't saying that he was anyone else, right? He was doing his own thing, which is partially what made him this person we love so much, was that he was a rebel and he wasn't, kind of following in anyone else's footsteps. So it's just funny because the first thing that Steve Jobs would not say is that he's someone else, right? Because he would have way too big of an ego to ever say that he was someone else. Anyway, so third reason is missed human connection. So one of the flaws is that Shah tended to over-rationalize things, and he missed cultural and human connections. Amit points out that Amit was the designer who designed those charging stations that I showed you, points out that Agassi's central thesis that people wanted to buy car service the way they buy phone service was flawed. Right, so he had this idea, but he just never tried it out. He built everything, he built all of this stuff, but he never really tried it out. So what I wanted to talk about, the reason that this talk is titled You Are Not a Creative Genius is because, and I should define terms here, right? So when I'm saying creative genius, I'm thinking of this Shah Agassiz figure, right? This bigger than life figure who's the star of the show, self-centered, territorial, gets their way, always right. I mean, and I could add so many more, characteristics to this list, and you probably have a bunch you could add to this list as well. And I think the really interesting, or the thing that I really want to push back on is this certainty, right? That they're certain, they're right, they're selling this thing before they've even conceived of what this thing is. Shah Agassiz was giving presentations before he had done anything, right? He was giving TED Talks, he was selling all of this stuff before he had even run the idea or even really conceived of what the idea was fully. And so maybe I was getting a little bit meta with this talk, but I was thinking about speeches or things that I've attended in the past that have really stuck with me. So for example, I was thinking of Sir Ken Robinson's talk on Do Schools Kill Creativity, or Brene Brown's TED Talk on the power of vulnerability, and kind of just reflecting on what made those powerful experiences for me. And what I kind of came to was that they asked me to rethink something, right? So with Ken Robinson's talk, he was asking us to rethink the way we conceive of education, right? The way we kind of measure success and failure in that space. Brene Brown, really kind of asking us to fundamentally rethink relationships. And so I thought, what am I coming here today and taking 40 minutes to ask you to rethink? And what I came to was the value of uncertainty, right? And I think a lot of us have heard talks on, the value of beginner's mindset and these different things, and I just want to reflect for a minute on the last experience that you had where you went into it uncertain. So maybe you were traveling to a new place, maybe you were starting a project, maybe you had a really great idea that you were so excited about, but you weren't certain if it was actually a good idea or what would happen with it. And just kind of think of that mind space that you go to, right? So in that place you listen, right? Maybe you ask for directions, you talk to people about it, you start to listen when you're uncertain about something. You experiment. I am with transitions. Anyway, you experiment, right? You try different stuff out because you're not actually sure what will work. Maybe you walk down one street and it's the wrong way, so you turn around and you try a different street or whatever. You test assumptions, right? So if you don't know, you try out different things, you experiment, you test out these assumptions that you're making, some of which are really, really crucial. Guys, I had so much fun with the transition. Okay, so who knows what this place is? Does anyone know? That's close, but not true. Not exactly. Yeah, it's Disneyland Paris. So this is Disneyland Paris, and I wanted to talk about this idea of testing assumptions and like why does it matter and whatever. We're all moving so fast we don't have time to test all of our assumptions, whatever. So the story of Disneyland Paris is pretty interesting. Probably a lot of you know it. But Disney had obviously had these very, very successful theme parks in Southern California, Florida, Tokyo, and what they found was that people typically spent 3 days at the park, and so they built out all of this infrastructure assuming that people would spend 3 days at Disneyland Paris, right? Like, totally makes sense. So they spent tons of money building out this stuff based on this assumption that people would spend 3 days there. And what happened was the park opened, obviously it's beautiful, people came, but this weird thing happened, which was people only spent 1 day. And so in the first 2 years of Disneyland Paris, they lost roughly $1 billion, right? And they were like, what is going on? Why are we losing all of this money? And what they realized was that that assumption that people would spend 3 days was fundamentally flawed because Disneyland Paris, unlike the other Disneyland parks, only had 1/3 as many rides. So people would come, and they would do all of the rides in 1 day, and then they wouldn't need to spend the night, right? Because they had already done all of the rides, they'd done everything they wanted to do at the park. And so, obviously this story isn't exactly about like UX research, working in like a usability lab, whatever. But I feel like it's such an important point to remember the cost of these assumptions that we go into projects with, and to really be cognizant of these assumptions we're making. Like I have, for every project that, like I just left Vivid Smart Home, and I can think of a number of projects where there were some very fundamental assumptions being made that honestly the team couldn't say whether they were true or false, right? And so that's where like user experience research really, really starts to be important, because you can test those things before you waste $1 billion, right? So I want you to think of a project that you're working on and what assumptions you're making. Like what things have to be true for you to have the outcome that you're expecting to have, right? So maybe you're assuming people want to do something. Maybe you're assuming that people feel comfortable with something. Maybe you're assuming that the service experience that you create for your electric cars will be something that people are comfortable with, right? Or that price point is something that people are comfortable with. I know this is like probably not going to go well, but do any of you have an assumption that you want to share? Anyone? Yeah.
If we build it, people will buy it.
Okay, good. Yeah, if we build it, people will buy it. Like, I think we have all made that assumption about something because we're too scared to actually try it out and know if people want it. Yeah.
That people want less steps.
That people want less steps? Okay, yeah, that it'll make it easier to have it be more condensed. Anyone else? Yeah.
Pretty much anytime we open our mouth and some those people would, like, we should check that assumption before we actually say it.
Yeah, definitely. So for those of you who didn't hear, he said anytime that we open our mouths and we say that most people would, right, or we make these generalizations about people, and I feel like, especially as UX researchers, that's something that we need to be really, really careful of, right? Because it's easy to be like, oh, well, I talked to 7 people and everybody said this. It's like, no, 7 people said that, right? Like, not everybody. And so I think, and that's something that I've seen, a lot of people a way that I've seen UX research misconstrued is they think, oh, we're gonna go from uncertainty to certainty, right? And that's not how this works. Like I've never had an experience doing UX research where I'm like, and now I'm certain, and this is gonna be a huge success. Book closed. Like that's just not how it works. Like you go from uncertainty to less uncertainty, right? Like it's a graph like that where you get slowly closer to the line, but you never quite touch it, right? Like there's always going to be risk, and you're going to have to, kind of place these bets, and that isn't really UX research. Its role is just to reduce the uncertainty that we feel, right? That's very, very healthy to start with. But then as we move from the point of, I have an idea, I'm so excited, to, I'm now gonna ask people for $100 million. Like you wanna get to a place where you are less uncertain. And just as like a quick call out, I feel like when people think of UX research, sometimes like I've run into this thing, especially I think in this area where maybe UX research is a little bit newer, that people are like, oh yeah, UX research, aka usability testing, and I'm always like, wait, what? Like it's just a very, very narrow view of what UX research is, right? Like if you kind of get a little bit outside of the 4 UX researchers that I know in Utah, right? And like you get to that bigger community, like it means so much more, right? Like it's really any time that you're like prototyping, experimenting, testing your ideas, validating, checking, like exploring, being generative, and I purposely make it that broad because I think, like, as all of you probably know, like it includes you, right? Like UX research done in a lab with a UX researcher and a participant is like pretty worthless. Like I would say that as the designer comes to the table and the designer starts to lead those discussions, maybe facilitated by a UX researcher, like you get these, growing circles of value as more people are included in that. So I just put this up there to say, UX research is more than usability testing, and if anyone kind of says, great, yeah, let's do usability tests, you should say, awesome, let's do usability tests, and let's do something to even figure out if this is a good idea. Let's talk to people in their homes, let's do some contextual inquiry. So yeah, it's bigger than just usability testing. Okay, so I want to tell you another story. I think we all are kind of like obsessed with Airbnb, right? Like it's just so cool, and like, I don't know how many of you have visited the headquarters, but it's just so cool, and there's like this huge open space, and this atrium, and it's like very much like the core competency of the founders is design, and you feel that in every part of the company. So Airbnb was founded in 2009, January of 2009, right? By a couple designers. I'm sure most of you know the story. I think there was like a conference or something, and they were like, man, I wish we could rent out our room or rent a room because it's so expensive in San Francisco. And so they had this idea, and they submitted it to Y Combinator, and they got accepted, which is so cool. And so they got $20,000, right? Like big bucks, especially in San Francisco. Like maybe you could pay your rent for 10 months if you shared one room with other roommates. So they got $20,000. And then, 3 months later, they got $600,000. And the story that I want to tell about them is, you read about it and it's this massive, massive success, but what happened in the beginning, right? So for the first year, and maybe I'm gonna just quickly go through. For the first year of the business, we sat behind our computer screens trying to code our way through problems. We believed this was the dogma of how you're supposed to solve problems in Silicon Valley. So what they saw was that their revenue for the first year was just a flat line, $200 every week. So like you combine that with the $20,000 that they had to start, like obviously everyone knew it was going to be like a huge success, right? So anyway, they're making $200, their revenues is flat line, they're like, we're supposed to be a hockey stick, like aren't all startups like this hockey stick of success? And so they're sitting with Paul Graham, who's one of the investors at Y Combinator, and they're looking at the website, and they, are kind of just going through it, and they're like, specifically in New York, they're like, why isn't anyone renting our rooms? Like, this is such a great idea. And they realize that it looks super sketchy. Like all the pictures on there are like some weirdo like Craigslist picture, right? Like you can't even see the room, and it just looks like dark and dingy, and like, yeah, oh, I totally want to rent this room from this sketchy person in New York. Like, no. And so they had this realization as they put themselves into the shoes of people who would be going on this site that was like very not proven, a weird idea, like staying in some person's house with them. And they were like, I wonder if we, instead of trying to like change some code, if we just like should have flew to New York, took some photos that were nice, and then we put them on the site, what would happen? So the founders fly to New York, maxing out their credit cards, right? Because at this point they like already have no money. And they go and they take these really nice photos and they put them on their website. And their revenue, which has been a total flat line, jumps up to, hold your breath for this, $400 for that week, right? So it's like, but really it was a huge success for them, right? In that moment, because they had been able to kind of crack that straight line of nothing, just by kind of trying something new. And it was this epiphany moment for Joe Gibbia, like, where he was like, oh, I can just try stuff that's not scalable. Like, I don't have to do something that is gonna, for 10,000 people or 1 million people, like, I can just do experiments. And so he says, it was only when they gave themselves permission to experiment with non-scalable changes to the business that they climbed out of what they called the trough of sorrow. And And I think this philosophy, like the more you read about Airbnb, this philosophy has really, really carried over. So he talks about being a design student and actually this principle of becoming the patient, right? So when they were given a problem at design school, a challenge, they had to actually go to the hospital, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, lay in the bed and become the patient and actually like feel like, oh my gosh, this mattress is super uncomfortable, this button is like too far, I can't reach it because I can't move in this bed. And so they had to become the patient. And I think the reason this story is so inspiring for me is because like Airbnb, arguably, is kind of like the ideal right now, right? Because it's fun and it's interesting and it works well and it's allowing us to connect as a community and it's really just kind of this cool project that changed the world, right? And it wasn't until 2 years later that they actually received any kind of significant amount of money, right? So it took them 2 years to get 7.2. Well, I guess 7.2 plus the 600 plus the 20, so roughly like 7.8. $1 million, right? And that's compared to this other success, this other story that like seemed like such a success, right? Better Place had $200 million in the first month. Like, imagine any of us in that situation. We would, our mouths would be watering and we would just be like rolling in the money that, was coming in so freely. And I think this is kind of, to just bring home that point of that the value of uncertainty is so great, right? Like, give yourself over to it, invest in that, be comfortable with it. Because if you start out so certain, you'll probably wind up like Better Place, right? With this amazing idea, everyone telling you you're so cool, tons of money coming in, and then a product that like no one actually wants to use, because you just decided, right? So I would say kind of give yourself over that, be comfortable with that, and then use these tools of design thinking and user experience research to really kind of get to a place where you do have that certainty, but it's hard won, right? It's not just a cool idea that you had and therefore everyone should do it. So I want to be sensitive to the problems that come up when people are actually trying to do this stuff, right? So I hear a ton of different concerns. I would say this is like one of the big ones, which is like, but we need to ship something. We're just gonna make something and we're gonna try it out and it's gonna be great. And I'm actually totally fine with that. So depending on the context. And here's what I mean. I think some people get really, really just tied to this idea of like, we have to do user experience research and it looks like this and it's gonna take 6 weeks and we're gonna like check these certain boxes, right? And I just don't really believe in that philosophy. Like, if you're gonna do something that takes a week to do, don't spend like 2 weeks doing research on whether or not you should do that thing, right? Like, if you can just build a prototype and launch a landing page, awesome. Just like do that. Like, that is user experience research in and of itself. So that's just a quick call, because it's something I see a lot where people get really, really attached to like this process that they have heard about or they've seen other people do, and they actually like miss the principle of said process, which is to experiment and to just like try stuff without like investing tons of time. And maybe I'll just tell a quick story because I just think it's so funny. So I was talking to this researcher at Stanford, and he works with like, basically he kind of like consults on these huge projects, and one of the projects that he consults on is a self-driving car, right? Which is really cool, and you're like, what? How do you like prototype a self-driving car? How do you like test that out, right? Like you need a car that drives itself, right? And so I'm sitting and I'm talking to him at this conference, and he's like, and I'm like, how did you do that? And he was like, okay, so we went to SFO, we rented a car, it was like $35, and then we got some cardboard, and we like put up this cardboard divider between the driver and the passenger. And then we like kind of set up this like theatrical like approach to the car so that people thought there was like a person in the back seat of the car that was like maybe controlling, like they weren't really sure. But the reality was they would sit in the passenger seat, they had the steering wheel and they're driving, and there's a person on the other side of the cardboard. And they're just like very explicitly told not to look behind the cardboard. And so they did this experiment, right, where this person thinks they're in a self-driving car, but they're in just a totally normal rental car with a piece of cardboard. Right? And so they were able to prototype this idea, and then it got a little bit crazier where they got like an English car that actually the driver, like the steering wheel was on the passenger side, and so people were in the driver's seat and they were like so sure that they were driving the self-driving car. But I just thought like that is such a good, like if you ever are like, well, I can't prototype this. I'm like, if they can prototype a self-driving car, you can for sure prototype like 3 pages of a website. Okay. Anyway, so I wanted to address some other research concerns that I hear that come up a lot. So research will slow us down, right? And I think this is a valid concern. Like, I'm not putting these up here to say that they're not real or they're not true or they don't happen like often, right? Because I think there's probably tons of cases that people can reference where it actually did slow it down because people got like just in the muck of it and anyway, so, or it's too expensive, right? Like, we don't have any money, we can't do this. But I wanted to ask you guys, who here has wasted a week of time working on a project and then they launched it and they realized it was the wrong problem, it was the wrong solution, maybe they didn't even launch it because like everyone got bored with it by the end of the week because they realized that like it wasn't that cool. So who's had that experience? Okay, how about a month? How about 6 months? A year? Yeah, like I could go on and on, right? And this isn't a problem that's unique to us. Like, I don't know how many of you know Jake Knapp, the guy who wrote Design Sprint. So I had an opportunity to interview him, and we're talking, and he's like, I cannot even tell you how much time I wasted at Google working on like random stuff, right? That like wasn't the right thing, nobody cared, it like died off, or like we put it out there and it was like, what were we doing? Like, what problem were we solving? Who were we solving for, right? Like, people waste years of their lives. People waste, Better Place alone wasted $900 million, right? Like, that is crazy. So when people say it's too expensive, I'm like, okay, well, it depends on the problem, right? It depends how much you're investing. Like, if you're investing $50 and like a week of your time, cool, whatever, go for it, like go crazy. But if you're building an international conglomerate with 900 million people, or $900 million going into this thing, like, I don't know, maybe you wanna like set up a fake self-driving car and like run it by a few people, right? So another one that comes up is, great, we learned all this stuff, what does it mean to my product? And again, like I think these are really valid concerns, and I've definitely had the experience of all of these things being true at one point or another. And so I want to just go back to that idea of there is no truth in process. So like you could apply all the right process to a given problem and not actually come out on top, right? Like I think this is true in so many parts of our lives. Like you have to go in with kind of the right pre-work done, right? Like you have to know the right questions, right? Like you have to know that you're looking for the problem, or you have to know the right problem and know that you're looking for a solution. So anyway, I just want to say there's no truth in process, because if you ever have a researcher or designer who's like, we have to do these 3 things exactly, and we just need to repeat that every time we have, you know, like a problem come up or whatever, like I would for sure push back on that, right? Because the whole idea of user experience research is to facilitate experimentation. And experiments aren't the same every time, right? So, so that's just a quote that I love. Okay, so do your user experience research right and you'll ship the right solution faster and cheaper. What a great slide. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about how this is applied to me in mixed methods, because again, I don't think it's like very traditional, right? Like I'm not doing usability tests on my like dinky website that just like lists my podcasts or like invites people to the Slack group. But I kind of started with this question, which was, how do I build a community for myself, right? So like at the beginning I asked, how many UX researchers are there in this room? And that response, like I was honestly kind of surprised there was even one, because I know of like 3 of us in Utah, maybe. Like 3, well now including you. Anyway, so I was in this position where I was really young in this community, and I had a ton of questions, and I was reading so much, and I was trying stuff out, but I didn't know if I was doing it right. And so, you know, I sat down with a boss one day, and who had done some contextual inquiry, basically like went into someone's home and observed them doing something, and we're having this conversation, and I was like, man, I should record this conversation. I wonder if like anyone else would be interested in this. And that was the beginning of it, right? Like I just started reaching out to people that I was interested in having a conversation with, and I bought an $80 USB mic. So it was like super fancy. And every interview for me was basically like a UX research interview, right? Because I was interviewing them about something, but I was also interviewing them about the idea, right? Like just sending out the email and seeing if they would participate. Like I got all this feedback of like, oh my gosh, it's so cool. Like there isn't any content like this out in the space, and we'd have a conversation about like these kind of content gaps that like the director of user experience at Google saw, or you know, I shouldn't say Jared School, but Jake Knapp, or all of these like people who are like a pretty big deal to me. Like I've become that person who like has my own separate list of celebrities that I'm like so excited to talk to, and everyone else is like, what? I'm like not excited at all. But anyway, so I started kind of just with this experimentation of, are people going to do this? Are people interested in this idea? Will people participate? And kind of doing these interviews one by one with them. And then it got bigger, right? Because now I was like, oh, cool. I actually feel like I have a real community. Like I have all these people who feel like mentors. How do I build a community for everyone else? And I tried different stuff. So like, at first I was launching an episode every week, and then I was like, this is insane. I just learned how to edit something in GarageBand like a week ago. So maybe I should try doing this every other week. And I was like, well, what should I do like in between? And I went back to that question of like, how do I build community, right? And so what I started doing was I started having Q&As in the off weeks, and inviting the person that had been on the show the week before to come, and everyone else in the community could ask them their questions. Right, and even with those, there was experimentation, because at first they were like really moderated, because I was like, I'm afraid everyone's gonna go crazy, and like, there's gonna be 10 questions at once, it'll be so out of control, which is like very like ambitious of me. Anyway, so I just like tested all of these little things I was doing, and still am doing all of these little experiments all the time. And the result has been a Slack community with like 1,600 people, and you have representation from everyone. So like you can come in our Slack community and you can talk to a recruiter from IDEO, you can talk to a researcher from Google, you can talk to someone from Dropbox, like literally you name a company, and you can find a researcher, a designer, a lot of recruiters who are in there just talking about these things and throwing around ideas, and a ton of people listening, which is really cool. And so I'm a firm believer in this stuff, just because maybe like I'm less confident by nature, maybe I just am curious and like experimenting, but I feel like you look at these cases of people who were successful, right? Even, Steve Jobs, the god of all gods, and he started by talking to different groups of people who would be users of these things. And I think, do I want to be a better place, or do I want to be an Airbnb? So. Yeah.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. You guys have any questions for Aryel?
I have something to say. I don't have a question. I just wanted to pitch that.
Thanks, Laura.
I think that you should pitch the toolbox on the McMillan site.
Oh, that's a good idea. So this is an interesting story, actually. So as I said, I kind of am constantly like experimenting with different ways to serve this community, and I'm part of all these different research groups, including my own, and so I don't even know if I've told you about this. I think I did, maybe. So I have this idea of like, we should make a research toolbox, right? Because people are constantly asking the same questions over and over. They're like, how do I do a diary study? What tools should I use to recruit, or whatever? And so we started kind of experimenting with the idea by creating these templates that people could contribute to. And it was like, okay, whatever. And I reached out to this guy that I'm friends with at IDEO, who's been on the show, and I was talking to him about the idea. Does this sound weird? Yes, it sounds weird. And anyway, so now where we're at is that we're actually doing kind of like intercept interviews. So when people say, I'm really curious about diary studies, like the reality is there's tons of content already about diary studies. Like, why are you asking this group of people about diary studies? So we're doing intercept interviews in the Slack group and asking them like, okay, what have you looked at already? Like, have you done any research before this? And kind of trying to understand why the existing solutions and tools aren't working. And we're actually gonna have an event at IDEO with a number of their researchers and designers to kind of workshop the idea and come up with a prototype and do all of that before we, invest a ton of money in building another design toolbox, because there's a number of them already, but obviously they're not working. So that's just another example of kind of how this stuff works, and being iterative with it, because that was for sure not my kind of initial approach to it. Thanks, Laura. Yeah.
So, thank you for this. This was awesome, actually. Obviously, research is important. Those of us that are smaller schools, the C class don't understand that research is a
Yeah, so the question was basically what happens when you have executives or managers who are asking you, who don't understand the value of research and want you to really quickly do something. Like, kind of how do you push back on that? And so this is kind of like how my whole journey started, right? It was like, I'm in this position where I feel like I'm constantly being asked to do the wrong thing and I'm so annoyed and I'm wasting my life. And I think just the first story that comes to my mind, the first thing that I kind of want to caution, because I think a lot of times we get into this place, or I found myself in this place where I was like, they're so dumb, they're wrong, they don't know anything, how do people choose C-levels, it's crazy, they all seem to be the worst. And I found myself kind of like getting into that, right? And I had this conversation again with that friend at IDEO, and it's actually like in that episode that I put out a couple weeks ago, but he talked about how, and the reason I keep bringing up IDEO is because as a researcher, they're kind of like the gold standard, maybe like the pentagram for graphic designers is like our IDEO. But, you know, they talked about how they work on these really specific timelines, right? Like they have 3 months to maybe like redesign the experience of aging in place, right? Like and to me, I was like, wait, what? You know, because for some reason, I guess I had this idea that like there's a ton of flexibility and they like took as much time as they needed, but of course it makes sense, they're a consultancy. And so they're working in these really strict timelines, and what Dan told me was like, basically we have this much time and then we have to move on to the next thing. So I guess my first word of caution is that everyone is working within constraints, right? Like even the coolest people who invented design thinking are working in time constraints that they may or may not like. So what I would say is, in that situation, there's a ton that you can do that's really lightweight to just try it out. So, you know, build a working prototype, right? Like, go to Envision, go to Keynote, build like a working prototype, and sit down and have a few people try it. Have people at your company, have people in the office next door. Don't be worried that someone's gonna steal your like best idea ever, because they're not. Like, they have other stuff. So yeah, just do whatever you can, whether it's lightweight or heavy, to try it out. So like that C-level, like let's say he wants a deliverable in a week, like you already have to make designs. We'll throw them into Envision and be like, hey, not only did I make this, I actually showed it to a few people, and that assumption that we had about putting the button here, like a bunch of people got confused. So I actually moved it down here is like my next drug, and I would love to show it to like 10 more people, because I have a few questions about like these 4 things, and I feel like it's really important to the success of this project to be able to answer those questions. And I would really hate to like waste, you know, 3 months of development resources and then find out that actually we should have done it like this. You know, because like executives want to be successful. They want to have products that people want to use and that are great products. And so I think like there has to be a little bit of empathy for them as well, right? So yeah, that would be my answer to that. Yeah.
So your discussion, you talked about kind of battle that goes between shareholders and UX researchers.
Yeah.
How do you keep the happiness between the two of them? Because it seems like that's usually what's going to lose.
Yeah. So it's funny, as I did more and more interviews with people who are really seasoned researchers, and you know, for example, like one conversation that sticks out to me is there's one UX researcher who works at a VC. He works at Google Ventures. He's like this super rad, nice guy, and he talked about how a lot of times UX researchers get very much into this idea of like, we are the customer advocate. And I thought, oh yeah, totally, like, I'm a customer advocate. And his point was that, and this is something that I've heard a lot of people who are more seasoned in their research careers bring up, which is like, we are an advocate for our stakeholders, right? Like, how do you make your stakeholder successful? You build something that customers want. You build something that customers love. And I think that like, we kind of have to be a little bit self-aware and flip that like stakeholder versus researcher, because I just don't think that it's true. Like if you're doing your job well, your stakeholders should be stoked, because you just saved them $900 million in a humongous embarrassment, right? Like you just saved them 3 months. You just saved them 4 employees leaving because they're super frustrated that they worked on something that no one cared about. So I think you can't be an advocate for the customer without also being an advocate for the stakeholder fundamentally. And so as a researcher, I think so much of your job is to communicate that and say, I just think this is so important because I really want the team to be invested and super excited about this thing that we're building. And I know that like we have this super tight deadline, so I'm gonna try this thing, you know, maybe after 5, right? Like I'm just gonna like throw it up on, you know, show it to a few friends. I'm gonna maybe actually like do some interesting recruiting. Like one time whatever, I'm not gonna get into that story. But yeah, so I guess all I'm saying is that I think that that's a false paradigm. Like, I don't think that the reality of working in tech is that your stakeholder is the enemy of your customer and that they want two different things, right? And I think it's just the role of the researcher to really communicate that. Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, after I read your bio, this course, your lecture, I was so intrigued with the fact that you put up this podcast, so I started listening to it, and it's really good. And it's really needed as a community, and I think it doesn't matter your level of expertise or how seasoned you are in the industry, it's so kick-ass. It's something to be curious and then create something that does look unique for everyone else. So thank you.
Like, thank you, that's so nice. Just one thing I would say about that is I feel like, for those of you who are like, I'm new in my career, I can't do stuff, I genuinely feel like I probably never would have done this thing if I was farther along in my career, because I would have been too scared of what like people who knew me or like, you know, already like respect my work or whatever would think about it. But I had like no table stakes. Like, just some like random UX researcher in Utah. Like, people all the time are like, wait, where are you from? Where did you come from? I had this guy at IDEO be like, so you have a PhD, right? And I was like, are you kidding? And he was like, well, I guess you don't need one. So I think that being kind of earlier in your career and not having people know anything about you can be a huge advantage, because you're not afraid of, you know, what you've already built. So anyway, thank you very much. Yeah.
Let me helpful to talk about some of those UX research methods that you can apply that are cheap and easy, like and fast. Like you mentioned some of them, like prototyping. But what are some of the things, like in my experience, one of the main problems that I see with designers or product managers is that we have this perception that there's no time, but there's so many simple, quick ways to test something out, like in just a few minutes, and identify all sorts of problems. And it's not elegant, it's not according to UX best practices, but it's still, you know, there's a lot of little methods there that help people still catch those. The perceptions that, oh, I can't do that, I don't have time, but any data is better than no data.
Yeah. So the question was basically like, what are quick and easy ways to do this kind of work? And I would say that's a big part of why I'm working on this research toolbox, right? To give resources to not only researchers who are trying to try new methods, but also people who are maybe outside the research community who want a little bit of confidence to try something new. But maybe just one statistic that you probably all already know about that I would throw out is 5 usability tests, right? So maybe let's say you spend half an hour on each of them, like 2.5 hours, maybe an hour spent recruiting, so 3.5 hours, another hour spent prototyping, 4.5 hours. You can identify 85% of usability issues, right? So that's like pretty basic stuff. Like, you could still have the totally wrong product, nobody cares, but at least they'll be able to use it, right? So, and you can look up a million examples of, you know, this company put the button in the wrong spot and then they changed it and they made $100 million in that day. Like, there's a lot of ways to really quickly and easily find out some of those issues. And I think also, like, my main piece of advice when it comes to research, and I think the main thing that has kept me from doing it in the past, is just a fear of, what if nobody likes this thing? Or like, what if nobody gets it, right? Because it's like, well, it's not done. They're not gonna get it, and then they're gonna like hate it, and then like it's gonna be dead. And I think as a community, right, like as people trying to innovate and all of these things, like we have to be a little bit fearless to show things, to talk about things, and yeah, not be so afraid that our idea is just gonna get squashed, you know, and maybe it does, and maybe that's fine because you didn't waste 6 years on it. So yeah, I would say, you know, be a little bit fearless and just put it in front of people. Have a conversation with, you know, if you're selling to baby boomers who live on their own or whatever, like go and talk to a few baby boomers and have a conversation. Like, there are very, very basic ways, but also there are just tons of resources online, like when you're looking for like kind of quick and easies. But
I think we're out of time, so let's get